be personal, right? So be united, be prepared, and be personal. Those are like the 3 main points of our training, right? And so be personal is the idea that, again, we're not making you experts on parity, we're making you experts on your own story. And if the whole idea of having, and I hate the word consumer, to be honest, but if the whole point of having consumers testifying is to humanize what we're talking about. We are not asking you, nor would we want you, to get up and talk about the 3rd paragraph of the federal legislation that, you know, is not being implemented or enforced. That is not what we want. We want you to get up there and talk coherently about your personal experience with parity violations. And that's it.
And not even necessarily parity violations, just trouble with insurance coverage.
Fair enough.
I mean, everyone speaks that language, and everyone's had trouble with insurance for something. Whether it's car insurance, health insurance, homeowners insurance. Everyone knows they can be difficult to deal with insurance, and so we want to make sure that you're saying, I have had a hard time with my insurance company, that I pay the premiums, and yet they're supposed to cover this and they're not. This isn't fair. This isn't fair, I think, should be the main thing we want to emphasize.
Absolutely. And the last thing that I just want to stress is that something as simple as reminding them, I live in your district, I'm a registered voter, I am a constituent, is a really important thing to say, and it's something that very easily can get overlooked, again, because you get enthralled in your story. But going back to kind of what we talked about in the beginning, that legislators want votes. Not only do they want them, they need them if they want to continue to be a legislator. And so connecting you to being a voter, a district member, a constituent is really important, because unfortunately, if you don't say that, some of them aren't going to care. And then these are just some small things. Keeping eye contact is important because it will keep somebody engaged. And in order to do that, you need to be prepared to not read your written testimony word for word, which comes back to practice, 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 right? If I spend hours writing my personal testimony out, but I haven't rehearsed it once, I'm not going to be able to bullet it and make eye contact and be engaging when I'm doing testimony. I'm just going to read it, and I promise you, you have a much slimmer chance of a legislator listening to you if you're just reading your testimony. You also get to submit your written testimony. So when I testify, what I normally do is I will look at my written testimony and I will take some bullet points, which are the points that I want to hit, and I would suggest that you don't have more than 5 of those. And so I will say at the beginning, I have written testimony, I'm submitting it, and it will go more into detail about the things that I'm talking about, but I'm just going to hit some main points here. And so that's how I testify. I'm not saying that's the only way to testify, but what happens with written testimony is it gets submitted, and either the chief of staff or the legislative aide for the legislator reads all of that. So that's the meat and potatoes of what you're handing in, right? And that can also be a little bit more technical, that can have statistics, that can have dates, things like that. But again, what's coming out of my mouth needs to be an attention grabber, right? I want to say something so shocking, so upsetting, so human, that Tim's heart drops and he listens to everything that I'm saying, right? If I start talking about the 3rd paragraph or the 2nd thing and the regulatory body that's not enforcing, like, it's important, but you don't connect to me on a personal level. And so the purpose of testifying is to connect on a personal level so that when this comes up to a vote, right, Tim's going to remember that I talked about the fact that my mother had to refinance her home to send me to treatment to save my life, right?
All right, so we've talked a little about what is parity, but it's a very simple concept, and insurance should cover behavioral health conditions like they treat physical health conditions. Very simple concept. There's a federal law called the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2008. This has been a law for a long time. And one thing that, with parity, insurance companies have done a good job bringing some things into parity, like outpatient visit limits and inpatient day limits. They used to have very restrictive written limits for those things. They don't have those anymore. But what we're really seeing now, and I'm sure, I think all of you have experienced it, is their managed care practices are much more restrictive for behavioral health than they are for other health conditions. So what this legislation does is it requires insurance companies to be transparent by submitting information to the Department of Banking and Insurance that would allow the regulators, who are experts in insurance, would allow them to compare how they're doing things for behavioral health with how they're doing things for medical health. That's all we're asking to do, the insurance companies. We're not asking to cover this or cover that or do this or this. Just give us the information so we can see that you're complying with this law. If you say that you are, show your work.
And I think that that's really important for you to be clear about, that this is not a medical necessity bill, right? So there's nothing in this legislation that talks about you have to cover, substance use disorder, 90-day inpatient. There is nothing that says you have to fail outpatient before you can get in. You shouldn't have to fail outpatient before you get inpatient, which are some of the things that, as people who have either suffered individually or had loved ones who have suffered, we know some of what that unfairness looks like. But I just think it's important that there's clarity around that's not what this bill does. This is a transparency and an accountability.
Yes, I mean, that's the main talking point you need to have here. Is all this legislation is doing is requiring insurers to be transparent and the Department of Banking and Insurance to be accountable and do their job. That's all we're asking. We're not asking anyone to cover this, cover that, do this, do that. Just show what you're doing, and also the regulatory agencies that your tax dollars fund are doing the jobs they're supposed to do.
Right.
And then the question is, everyone has, this is about insurance, so are you getting what you pay for when you buy insurance? It's really as simple as that.
And I also think, again, it's important because there are so many things that are unfair and not done right and broken, right? But this bill only does a couple very specific things, right? And so for someone who is uninsured or for someone who is on Medicaid, this bill does not affect or help those cases. And again, it's not that there shouldn't be thousands of other legislation, about to address all of the unfairness of our system. But since we are talking about this specific bill, it's just important that you understand that. And speaking from personal experience, I can get carried away with all of the things that are wrong, right? And there's so many of them that are wrong or broken. But it actually waters down my message when I start talking about things that don't directly relate to the legislation. So for example, bringing up something about, how it's hard for someone who's uninsured to get a treatment bed, absolutely, 100% important issue we need to be talking about. Not right now though, right? And so being able to separate those things is really important in reaching your ultimate goal, which is how can I craft my message in a way so it is received and not just sound waves. Okay, Rocky, Valerie.
I know I'm being a pain and a little selfish, but it does represent 50% of people in New Jersey. Is it defined anywhere that this is only for self-funded plans? Because I don't know if they even understand.
This is only for fully funded plans. That's something, again,
fully funded,
that's the level of knowledge and expertise that you shouldn't have to, a person testifying for legislation should not be expected to point out what percent of the market that this covers, or the Federal Department of Labor. Because look, this is the whole issue with insurance, is that it gets really complicated. There are so many different regulatory agencies that are potentially responsible for regulating insurance because of the complicated nature of how we do health insurance in this country. But you don't want to talk about it. You just want to talk very, very specifically. You want to focus on your story, what's happened to your loved ones in your lives, and how difficult it was with the insurance company. You don't need to worry about who's responsible for regulating. Even though this is very specific about Department of Banking Insurance, you don't need to worry about whether they cover you or not. You just need to say, this is what's happened to me.
Mhm.
This was. Can you believe that they did not say this wasn't medically necessary? And and say how difficult it was for your insurer to deal with them. That's all you really need to focus on.
But as a consumer, let's think positive, and this is all gonna get passed, right? My local legislator, then people go into his office and start complaining that this is still happening.
Mhm.
And he or she thinks that us voting for this bill will satisfy that.
Well, and so
Sorry.
there will be.
What I'm saying
There will be
that's
clearer.
that's the point that Mario was making a minute ago. Like, there are so many things wrong.
Okay.
This only solves
Got
like one or two issues, but it solves one or two issues.
And there will also be professionals testifying who have more information about the specifics of the legislation. And also, for example, someone like our Ed, right, who is our policy analyst, he will be meeting and talking with aides and legislators outside of testimony as well. And so there will be clarity around what specific issues this bill solves and doesn't solve, but those are not the questions that you as a consumer need to be answering when you testify.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep, no, got it.
All
Thank you.
right.
Can you explain why this particular bill, if I'm correct, is sort of a foundational bill that will then help further legislation to be enacted once this bill provides the
Sure,
information?
that's a great
Could
question.
you tell us why this is so important?
So what it does, so the transparency part, insurers will have to submit information showing how it is they design and apply their medical management practices for behavioral health and how they do it for physical health. If we find out there's no problems, well, great, problem solved, but I don't think we're gonna find that. So then when we find that they're doing this or they're doing that, that will help legislators have further solutions as to how they can come into compliance, and also help the Department of Banking and Insurance figure out how it can further regulate. Because this is when we've seen this information actually get submitted in some other states, like New York, and California, major problems. I mean, it would be very unlikely that any of the insurance carriers in this state actually do comply with the federal law. So that's why we need them to submit the information. If they say, well, no, we are in compliance, and say, all right, well,
Prove
then
it.
you shouldn't have a problem with them just showing us. Then you should welcome this.
So when I think about this bill, right, and I think that as a consumer and as someone who has lived in so much of the brokenness, right, like, I'm like, why don't they already know this, right? However, what this bill is, when I think of it, it's kind of like a fact-finding mission, right? So in order to make all of the changes that we as consumers, and I speak personally as someone who's in recovery almost 10 years from heroin addiction, that we personally know, I already know what the problems are because I've lived them and I've experienced them, right? And my life has been threatened as a result of them. However, even though I know them, we need proof, right? We need proof. And so what this bill is, it's like a fact-finding. So let's get on pen and paper what really is going on, right?
Here's the
so that we
talking
can
point.
deal with it.
Here's the thing, you don't have to use this phrase, but I've used this in other states to good effect, is all we're asking the insurance industry is to show your work. I mean, we ask sixth graders to do that in their math test. Why can't we ask the insurance industry to do that? I mean, they shouldn't have if they say they've got the right answer,
Right.
just show us, that's all. So we're not asking so much of them, we're just asking them to prove that they're in compliance, and if they're not, we're asking them to fix it, that's all.
But, I don't know what those words mean. So are you talking about the actual language that they use? Are you talking about who sits down to make those kind of decisions? In other words, what does it mean to be transparent? I mean,
Okay.
there's so much gobbledygook
Sure.
that's in this, the language of the legislation, or in the handbooks, right?
Yeah.
Right.
We've been
Yeah.
talking about it. I mean, I have a PhD, and to me, it's like,
Yeah.
I'm
That's
overwhelmed,
perfect.
and I think, how do people do it who aren't educated.
So that's
So
like,
what does that really mean?
that's your testimony, like right there,
Oh.
right?
I'm ignorant.
No, but you're right, right? And Tim and I were just joking before because it said Dobie is accountable, and I went in and I put Department of Banking and Insurance because we talk in these acronyms, right, that nobody has any idea what they mean. What does it mean to be transparent or accountable? And so for your layman understanding, which I hope is not offensive, being for the layperson, right, who's not a lawyer or a doctor or an insurance regulator, right, when we talk about transparency and accountability, all we're talking about is that insurance companies need to show their work.
Right.
They need to just identify what their reimbursement policies, what their medical management
Actually, I'll say,
policies.
you don't need to get into what they know what they need to do.
No, but they want to understand the bill.
Oh.
So it's just making clear how they make their decisions comparatively for behavioral health and physical
So
health.
here's so the answer you're and you wouldn't want to talk about this in testimony, but if you want to know specifically what it does, as you asked, is it about how they write the policies or how they do this or how they, it's about all of it. How is it that everything that you have written in that 700-page insurance contract you have, how when you sat down and wrote that, how is it that you are sure that the way it's written for behavioral health is no more stringent than the way it is for physical health? How then when you actually do some of this stuff, like for instance, when you do your medical necessity review to determine if inpatient treatment is still medically necessary, how are you doing that review? Is it just, you look at what the doctor said for 30 seconds, denied, or do you actually spend time looking at me? Are you doing it the same way you would do that for other medical conditions like cancer or diabetes or heart disease or anything like that?
So it's kind of like reporting on their internal practices. That's kind of an easy way, I think, to understand. And that encompasses everything, right? That encompasses what's a medical necessity, what's not medical necessity, how do they make that decision, who makes that decision, is there a different person doing behavioral health versus physical health, are those requirements equivalent or unparalleled? So it's all of that, plus probably 100 things that I don't know.
Right. I mean, Rocky, let's look specifically to your case. So they said that you did not meet the criteria for the medical necessity criteria that said that inpatient care was sort of needed. Well, who made that medical necessity criteria? So for instance, for on the medical side, did they have 7 doctors come up and meet and decide what's medically necessary and what's not? And then on the behavioral health side, Steve the intern did it. And if that was the case, they're not doing it the same way, and that would be illegal. So we just need to know how it is they're doing that, and then hundreds of other things. And it's complicated for them, and of course that's why we would never expect you to be an expert on that, because it's very difficult to understand. But they just need to show the information that would allow the regulators to determine if they are in compliance or not in compliance.
But I think what's even more, just as important is the second piece of it, is that we're demanding that Dobie make someone accountable.
Right.
Because,
Maybe you have to do that.
I looked at the New York State Insurance Commission website last night, and it's unbelievable.
Unbelievable good.
Unbelievably helpful,
Yeah.
shows the precedent, shows the laws, shows who to call, how you file a complaint. Dobie just says there's no problem. So I think that's just as important, is not only become transparent, but that someone in the state says, you're required, right? If you're gonna provide insurance to our residents who vote in our district, then you have to do A, B, and C. You have to show your work. It's like the teacher telling
But
the
here's
teacher.
what makes me nervous, is that organizations do this all the time. Organizations are set up to rationalize these kinds of decision-making. And how much is this gonna translate into paper pushing, checking off?
That's always an issue,
No,
right?
so part of this, the second part, the Department of Bank Insurance Accountability, you give them very specific instructions about how they're supposed to do it, so they can't just check a box.
So they have to be responsible for.
And that's what the legislation would require. The way that regulation is being done, the regulatory nature would change, right? We're looking for very specific things about their internal practices.
Right, and also it asks them, and this is where you start getting into things, words like processes, strategies, evidentiaries, that kind of stuff, like the complicated words. They're in the federal law, which is why you have to use them. We don't ask them just all right, show us how you're doing it. You know, it gives very specific instructions to show how you're doing this, show how you're doing this, and show how you're doing this, show how you're doing that. It gets it's very, very technical. That's why we would never want anyone to be an expert on it except the people that wrote it. But it doesn't just let some vague decision making, well, we do this, I think, we do that, and it's fine.
And we're gonna check a box and then it's gonna be forgotten
That
about.
actually that's a good point, because that's a problem. There's a number of states that's how they determine whether plans comply with law. They check a box that says yes.
And add up the numbers,
We do.
algorithms that,
Right.
But there's precedent, right? With like New York State.
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah,
other
so,
states
so
that this
yeah,
is
that was
working.
written into it wasn't just,
Yeah.
we didn't just invent it, it came from New York,
Yeah.
California, we used that's that.
In addition, when we talk about Adobe being accountable, it's not just asking, this bill doesn't just ask the insurance companies to reassure Adobe. Adobe has to then make public and accessible to the public information so that
Right,
the
right.
public can be assured that everything's on the
This
level.
won't go, this isn't just gonna go into a black box and no one's
Right.
gonna know about it. This is gonna be available for public inspection.
And I think also when we think about this, again, I think it's really important that you guys have some understanding, but I think we are getting a little bit away from what your testimony should be, right? Because I think this is an important conversation, and I think there's great comfort and great satisfaction in kind of understanding all of this. However, I also want to have there be a discernment between the conversation that we've gotten into the last 10
Right.
minutes is disconnected
Right, so
from
this
your
is-
testimony.
That's a great point. So, yeah, I think it's critical that you do understand this, and I appreciate, answering the questions. But when you actually, this is important for you to know this, just so you don't want to testify in support of something you don't know about. I mean,
Right.
I wouldn't do that. But when you actually are talking to them, it's got to be about your story, what's happened to you,
Right.
and the pain that you've experienced, the pain your loved ones have experienced, and the essential, and also, the next slide gets into the specific talking points, but this is not about the abstract. This is about life and death. I mean, this is, when treatment is, when someone has, say, suicidal ideation and they're denied the treatment.
Because they have a plan, but they didn't have bullets for their
Right,
gun.
so let me give you,
Like,
this is something that Patrick Kennedy experienced in terms of, someone that he knew who experienced a treatment denial. The medical necessity reviewer for the insurance company said, was he actively suicidal? And he said, yes, he is. Well, does he have a plan? Yes, he plans to shoot himself. Does he have a gun? He does have a gun. Does he have bullets?
Okay.
And it's like, I mean, that's the level. Would they ever?
check.
Would they ever do that if someone was, he has chest pains? Well, does he have tingling in his arm?
Yeah.
Well, is he having shortness of breath? Like, no, not medically necessary.
or no, is he shortness of breath? Yes. Is he literally on the floor convulsing? No, not medically necessary.
Yeah.
That's like the comparison there in my brain, right? And those are also the kinds of things that people hear, right? One of my favorite things to do when I'm testifying about addiction and behavioral health issues is likening it to other chronic treatable illnesses, right? So diabetes, asthma, heart disease, things that can often have some self-inflictual nature, right? My uncle died from diabetes. He was morbidly obese. He had his toe cut off, and then he had the rest of them cut off, and then his foot amputated, and then his leg amputated, and then he died. David never changed the way he ate. He never changed, and he never exercised. He never lost weight. He never was willing to make these life decisions to enhance his physical health.
Right, but they would never think of saying, well, your amputation isn't medically necessary because
Right.
you didn't.
Right, so not once did they deny him insulin or treatment or amputation or medication or any of these things because he continued to make poor life decisions and was unwilling to take some of those actions. And so it's there, to me, that's the way I liken that to how is that different than somebody who continues to use or won't move into a halfway house or whatever those life changes are. We're very quick to condemn them as, oh, well, this is self-inflicted or self-imposed because little Bobby won't change, right? And some of that is true. Some of that is true. However, that doesn't make it any less medically necessary to treat the brain condition, right? And so that's my favorite way to testify. And you know, Tim is really going to kind of get into what your primary talking points. But for me, there's a very simple parallel when you compare the way physical health is treated and when, you know, behavioral conditions are treated.
Right. So let's move into how to do this. So I think.
All right, I'm sorry, but I have just one more question about this, and I think you can answer it quickly. So one is, where are we in this process? Well, not we. Where are you in this process of the bill? Where is it in the legislative process?
Just been introduced on Thursday.
It's been proposed for introduction, and Ed's going to talk about this a little bit at the end,
Okay.
but the bill has been proposed for introduction. It can't be introduced except on a quorum day. So it's been proposed, there's both a Senate bill and an Assembly bill, and the next quorum day is this coming Thursday. So my understanding is that most likely it will be formally introduced on Thursday.